Today. Thank you everyone for coming to Talks at Google. It is my pleasure to welcome Beau Kilmer of the RAND Corporation. He's the co-author of Marijuana Legalization, What Everyone Needs to Know. After the talk, we will have a little Q&A, which will not be recorded, so you can ask some for your questions perhaps. Okay, so everyone please give a big warm welcome to Beau Kilmer.
All right. All right, well, is this on? Yep. Great. Well, thank you, Scott, and I want to thank my friend Jeremy Miles for making this whole thing happen. And I want to thank all of you for taking some time out of your day to come chat about marijuana policy. As Scott mentioned, I work at the RAND Corporation. Our headquarters are just down Main Street. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that really tries to focus on improving policy and decision-making through research and analysis. I started at RAND as a drug policy intern about 20 years ago, and I never really left the organization. But it was about 6 years ago, I'm leaving Amsterdam. The guy driving the car seems to know everyone and everything associated with the Dutch drug trade. So I'm just peppering him with questions about trade routes and wholesale prices. This goes on for about 2.5 hours. We end up pulling into this kind of nondescript building, almost seems like it's in a neighborhood. Walk out, get into the building, and the guy who runs the place comes up and he starts answering all my questions, starts showing me some documents, and then starts walking me around the place. Well, not long enough before we get to the flowering room. And I gotta tell you, I felt like I was a kid in a candy store. But not because I was around a bunch of cannabis. I felt like I was a kid in a candy store because I was around a bunch of cannabis data. You see, I was in the only place in all the Netherlands where it was actually legal to produce marijuana. You know, a lot of people think it was legalized there, but that's not the case. Yes, if you're 18 or older, you can walk into one of the coffee shops and buy up to 5 grams because they have an official policy of not enforcing the law against small-scale transactions. So you kind of think about it being legal in the front door. However, it's still prohibited to grow and actually sell marijuana to those coffee shops. So it's actually illegal in the back door. But the facility I was in was the place where they were producing all of their medical cannabis. So they would produce it there, they would package it, it would get tested, and then it would actually be shipped to pharmacies. Very different from here in Venice with the dispensaries. I mean, actually would go to real pharmacies. But when the guy kind of opened up his books and kind of showed me the costs of what it took to kind of run the place, I mean, that's when my jaw dropped. He had calculated that the incremental or the marginal cost of producing and testing what was arguably some of the highest quality marijuana produced in the world was on the order of about €1 per gram. Yeah, and so that just confirmed to me that wow, if we actually legalize in the United States or elsewhere, you're going to see kind of a big push down on the prices. And I got to tell you, this place where I was, it wasn't necessarily, relative to kind of what you see here in parts of California or Colorado or Washington, this wasn't a big facility. That flowering room I was telling you about was only about 600 square feet. So it made me realize again that if you legalize in the United States, you get rid of the risk, you allow for big industrial grows, and you allow competition, you're really going to push down those production and the distribution costs. Well, you may be wondering, well, so what? Who cares? But it turns out that for a lot of the outcomes that actually get discussed in marijuana legalization debates, what happens to price really matters. Price is going to influence what happens to the illicit market. It's going to influence what happens to tax revenues. And it's also going to have implications for consumption and public health. So it was kind of that experience combined with some of the work that I had done trying to project what would happen with legalization if it happened in California, not only in the state, but also what it would mean for the Mexican drug trafficking organizations that really influenced a lot of the insights that I provided to both editions of the book. So around 2011 and 2012, we spent a lot of time kind of putting this book together, get it published in 2012. Well, and then what happens? Legalization. In November, what happened in November of 2012 was really unprecedented. There, the voters in Washington and Colorado, they not only voted to get rid of the prohibition on marijuana, they actually voted to allow for-profit corporations to come in and begin producing and selling. Very different from how things are set up in the Netherlands. And then at the end of 2013, you had Uruguay became the first country in the world to legalize. November 2014, you had Alaska, Oregon, District of Columbia, all legalized. So by around 2015, 2016, we knew it was actually time for an update. And so we released the new version here in 2016. But both books kind of follow the same format. It's about 140, 150 frequently asked questions. We've got questions in there. What is marijuana? When was it prohibited? What are the arguments that people are making about why you should legalize? Personal freedom, criminal justice issues, tax revenues. We've got a whole chapter focused on kind of summarizing the literature on the health risks associated with marijuana. We've got a whole other chapter that's focused on what's known about the medical benefits. And then we also have a whole chapter focused on the non-medical benefits. But I have to say that's a pretty thin chapter since there isn't a lot of academic research focused on the non-medical benefits of marijuana. But with the book, we had this large focus on health, but I have to say one of the biggest takeaways from what we did is that you got to be skeptical of anyone who claims that they know whether or not marijuana legalization is going to be a net positive or a net negative for public health. We really don't know. In fact, even if marijuana legalization over time, if it leads to a large increase in youth consumption, a large increase in dependence, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a net negative from a public health standpoint, because so much is going to depend on what happens to the consumption of alcohol, how legalization influences the consumption of tobacco, prescription opioids, and other drugs. And so a lot of how this is going to play out with respect to public health or some of the other outcomes is going to depend on a lot of these design considerations or the implementation issues. So what I wanted to do for the next 10 minutes or so are kind of walk through 4 of these design issues, which I'll conveniently begin with the letter P, that I think that are really going to shape how this all plays out. And the first one is profit motive. If you are a jurisdiction and you're thinking about alternatives to prohibiting marijuana supply, you actually have a lot of options. You don't have to allow for-profit companies to come in. I mean, that's what we're going to be seeing in California, what's happening in Washington and Colorado. A couple reasons to potentially be concerned about this. Pareto's law, the 80-20 rule is in effect. So it's 20% of your marijuana users that account for about 80% of the consumption. These are your daily and your near daily users. So if you allow a bunch of for-profit companies to come in, realize that's who they're going to be targeting. They're going to be trying to create heavy users and try to nurture those that are already in the market. I mean, this is what we see with alcohol. 80-20 rule applies there as well. Another potential issue with kind of allowing kind of a for-profit system is with the creation of a lobby. And if that lobby ends up acting anything like the alcohol and the tobacco lobbies, it may not, who knows, but if they act like them, then we would expect over time that they would then begin to push against regulations, push against taxation, and then maybe push against any types of changes that were in theory supposed to be influencing public health. But the bottom line is that you've got a lot of options here. So this is actually a figure that I produced with some colleagues for the state of Vermont. So, Rand, we don't have an official position on marijuana legalization or marijuana policy. But a couple of years ago, the governor of Vermont kind of saw the writing on the wall. He knew that they were going to be having discussions about legalization. So he wanted some work done to kind of help facilitate or kind of help inform the debates they were going to be having. And so I told the governor's, his staff, I said, hey, look, Rand's not going to come out and say, don't legalize or you should legalize. But what we can do is kind of walk you through a lot of the different options that are out there and talk about some of the potential trade-offs and what could be maybe some of the unintended consequences. And so we have a whole chapter that's focused on, well, how do you actually supply marijuana? And so this is kind of the big figure from that chapter. And in the piece, and we talk about this in the book as well, we kind of talk about the pros and cons of these different approaches. For example, if you wanted to legalize but didn't necessarily want to allow for-profit corporations, you could actually you've got at least 3 options here, right? You could just allow adults to grow their own. In fact, that's what's happening in Washington, D.C. That's what the voters approved there, and that's actually what's being debated in Vermont. You could also potentially have cannabis buyers clubs or cooperatives. This is what they're doing in Spain. Uruguay is setting these up as well. You also have them kind of popping up in different parts of Europe. You could actually do with the Dutch model and just kind of allowing the retail sales, but kind of keeping the back door still illegal. But there are a couple criticisms with these potential models. One, it might be hard to regulate the product, and that's something that for people who want to legalize, that's something that's very important. Let's regulate it and kind of test it. Another criticism of these models is that, well, they might not necessarily bring in a lot of revenue, right? And there's some people that this is an important piece of why they want to legalize. They want to bring in significant revenues. I have to say, when Uruguay legalized, that was not part of the calculus whatsoever. And there was actually kind of a different model, whereas in the States, it seems that the public's for this and the politicians are kind of standing back. In Uruguay, it was the exact opposite. The government wanted this, and the population at the time, 2/3 of them were against it. But there, the reasons for doing this, they wanted to reduce violence associated with the Paraguayan traffickers coming in, and they also thought it made sense from a human rights standpoint. But when it came to revenues, that wasn't really part of the discussions at all. But if you are a jurisdiction and you want to legalize, and revenues are important for you, you still have other options out there besides just allowing for-profit industry to kind of take over. For example, you could have government stores. And in fact, there's this one place, it's a small city, North Bonneville, Washington. They actually have a city-owned marijuana shop where they're selling. A lot of places don't talk about this because of the federal prohibition, right? And if you're a state and you set something like this up, you're essentially ordering your employees to violate federal law. So in some places, they're kind of worried about this. North Bonneville, not so much. I think the store opened up either 2014, 2015. There's been no crackdown. You could also potentially limit the market to nonprofit organizations. Potentially those that maybe have a focus on child welfare or public health. And even if you are going to allow for-profit companies to get involved, you could limit it to those kind of for-benefit corporations that have social and environmental goals. For example, those that focus on the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profits. So you've got a lot of options here, and while here in California, the state's in the process of trying to develop regulations, with the passage of Proposition 64 last November, it's going to leave a lot of discretion up to the local governments about whether or not to allow production in the area, to allow retail stores, or even marijuana bars. So local jurisdictions can make decisions about this as well. So they could have shops, but they don't necessarily have to be for profit. So there are options there. The next P I want to talk about is potency. And so one of the decisions confronting jurisdictions is, do you try to put a limit on it? Right? There are dozens of cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. THC is the one that gets the most attention. That's what's responsible for getting you high, but for some people can increase panic attacks, can even possibly increase the probability of experiencing a psychotic symptom. We estimated, it was about 10 years ago, was the last time we looked at this, we estimated that right around 2007, 2008, of all the marijuana that was consumed in the United States, probably between 40 to 67% of it at that time was still coming from Mexico. And the stuff that was coming from Mexico probably ranged between 4 to 8% THC. You walk into any of the dispensaries now, you're seeing products well in excess of 20% THC. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's what everyone's buying, but we ended up just doing some work for the state of Washington. We're analyzing all the transactions that have happened since they legalized. And sure enough, we're finding that flower dominates all sales, but within the flower sales, it's sales of products that are at least 20% THC that accounts for most of the most of the transactions. And then you also have, you've got the concentrates and some of the extracts that people will dab or even vaporize that can be 75, 80% THC. Thing to keep in mind is most of the research that's been done on the health consequences, whether they be the risks or the benefits, a lot of the studies that kind of get quoted in marijuana policy debates, they're largely focused on people who were smoking low potency product in the 80s and 90s. We really don't have much information about the health consequences of these higher potency products. We do know that if you vaporize as opposed to smoking a joint, you're not going to have the combustion, so you're not going to get as many carcinogens from the smoke. But we really don't know. Take a high school kid who smokes a joint a day versus the high school kid who dabs every day. We really don't know if one is better than the other in terms of kind of overall development there. And so, as I said, one of the things jurisdictions have to think about is, do they, especially if you're a risk-averse jurisdiction, do you initially want to put a limit on THC in these products? Because especially if you're going to allow for-profit companies to get involved, once that train starts, it can be a heck of a lot harder. If you decide 10 years later that you want to put limits on it, it can be a lot harder. We even saw that with the tobacco industry and flavored products. It took a long time to get flavored products out of tobacco, and we still have menthol. But as I said, THC is the cannabinoid that gets most of the attention. But there's another one that seems to be getting more attention not only in the press but also from scientists, and that's CBD. And so CBD is not necessarily going to get you high, but CBD is believed to potentially offset some of the negative effects of THC in terms of anxiety and potentially psychotic symptoms. And so my guess is that 10 years from now, or maybe even sooner than that, a lot of these marijuana policy debates are actually going to focus on what should the THC to CBD ratio be. So it won't necessarily be about just THC, but also, should we have a floor for CBD? But I have to say the evidence isn't there yet. We can't tell you what the optimal ratio is, but I know that more scientists are kind of looking into that. But the bottom line is if you're a jurisdiction, you have control over what's sold in your jurisdictions. The question is whether or not you're going to use that discretion to potentially shape the market, especially kind of given some of the, that we really don't know how this is going to play out from a health perspective. The third P I want to talk about is price. As I mentioned before, with legalization, there are a number of reasons why we would expect that production and distribution costs to go down, right? Most importantly, you're getting rid of the risk. Right? You go outside of you go to Kansas, for example. There you buy marijuana, you buy cocaine, or buy heroin. A lot of what you're doing is compensating the drug dealer and everyone else along that supply chain for the risk of arrest and risk of incarceration. You get rid of that, that's going to dramatically reduce the cost. You also allow increasing returns to scale. If you allow allow big production, you've got competition, changes in technology. So there are kind of a number of reasons why we would expect these costs to go down over time. Now, of course, as I said, price is important for thinking about the illicit market, what's happening with consumption, also in terms of what happens with tax revenues. So it might be that jurisdictions will want to do something to potentially kind of inflate the price. And their jurisdictions have a number of options. Obviously they could tax, put a tax on the product. They could impose a minimum price. You could also, just have less competition. You could also impose a number of regulations which could add on costs. So jurisdictions have decisions there. But the thing about taxation is that really nobody knows the best way to tax marijuana. And the issue is if the tax is too high, you're still going to have the illicit market. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to help jurisdictions begin to think through some of the pros and cons of these different options. The one that gets the most attention, and you see in most states that have legalized, is an ad valorem tax, just based on price. For example, 15% at retail, or in Washington State, it's 37% at the retail level. The advantage to that is it's easy. People know those types of taxes. It's easy to apply. A couple potential drawbacks. One, if you're not smart about bundling, people can beat it. I'll sell you this pipe for $30 and give you the weed for free. The other potential drawback to an ad valorem tax is as the prices go down, so will your revenue per sale. So this is why you're going to as more analysts and researchers get into this, you're seeing more projections. Here's what the marijuana market's going to look like in 2021, 2025, and the big numbers, lots of billions. The thing you kind of have to keep in mind is, when you're kind of looking at those models, is are they kind of building in the potential for some of these price drops and what that's going to mean for tax revenues? Because I think a lot of them are not doing that. And especially as more states get on board, if you had to change at the federal level, they said you could dramatically reduce those prices. The second option for taxation is a weight-based tax. And this is actually what they're doing in Alaska, $50 an ounce at the wholesale level. And once again, the advantage to that is that it's easy to apply. You just do it right there, before it goes to the retailers. But the potential drawback to that is if you make the tax based on weight, it creates incentives for the producers to produce more potent marijuana, and also for people to purchase more potent marijuana. And to the extent that we really don't know much about the health consequences there, that's an issue for some people. And I should say, when we talk about the concentrates and the high THC products, the other big unknown is we don't know much about titration. That is, where someone maybe, say you had a 5% joint and someone used to smoke the whole thing. Well, if they had a joint that was then 15% THC, are they only smoking a third of it? There isn't much research on that. But so when we begin thinking about these health consequences, that's going to be important, and especially in terms of you think about effects on the lungs and the types of the different devices that people are using. But another way of tax, there are a number of different ways, but the other way that they're starting to talk about in Canada, and I think it deserves some serious attention, is taxing as a function of THC. Tax as a function of the amount of intoxication. And in fact, I mean, that's what our federal alcohol tax is based on, the amount of alcohol. And the idea there would be, to the extent that we don't know much about about the health effects of these high potency products, if you're not going to put a limit on it, at least if you apply a THC tax, you could then try to nudge users towards some of the lower potency products, at least make it more expensive, if people really want to get intoxicated. And that hasn't gotten the THC tax really hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the States. I mean, most of the people that are writing the ballots, they want to put something simple on there, so it's very easy to just put an ad valorem tax. But the other issue is, you got to make sure that you feel really good about your testing and labeling regime. Because if you have a great testing and labeling regime, it's going to be very easy to impose a THC tax. But if you don't have a good testing regime, and you run into these issues now, especially with the federal prohibition, right? In terms of, for example, some of these states, they've got, the states themselves aren't necessarily doing the testing. They're working with a third party that then's monitoring the other testers. And in some of the places, you've got gaming going on. And I've heard, the director of public health in Colorado say that he would like to set up a lab where the state of Colorado would do the testing, but he's worried. But if you were to do that, you'd then be ordering your employees to violate federal law. So that's why it doesn't get as much attention here. Canada, they've had a regulated a medical system for quite some time. I think they've got 3 dozen. The way it works is they've got about 3 dozen producers, and the only way it's legal at the federal level is for you to get it from those producers, and then you order online, and then they just send it to you. That's legally, that's how it's legal under federal law. But of course, in BC and some of the other places, you've got dispensaries all over the place, which are kind of in this legal gray area. But the bottom line is there are a lot of different ways that you could tax the product. Tax is a function of the amount of canopy. But the implications that you make about taxing could down the line have really important implications for health. The final P I want to talk about is permanency. And as I said, nobody knows the best way to tax marijuana. Nobody knows the best way to regulate it. So you would, if you're smart about this, you want to kind of build in some flexibility. So as you learn more about what's happening in other jurisdictions, as we learn more about different cannabinoids and the interactions with the cannabinoids, that we might be able, that you kind of want to build that in. And for example, but it's a lot easier to kind of build in that flexibility at the beginning, as opposed to try to force it after a law has been in place for quite some time. For example, I mean, especially with taxation, do you want changes in taxation to have to go to the voters, or do you want it to go to, is it going to have to be some legislative group, or do you want to have an independent body making decisions about the taxation? So these are decisions that you would have to make before, a policy ends up getting passed. I showed those different options, those different middle ground options. I think for some jurisdictions, the middle ground might be a destination. For other places, it may just be a step along the way, especially for risk-averse places. And so another option, for these jurisdictions is to, begin to build in a sunset clause and say, you know what, we're not happy with the current system. We're going to try, supply regime X for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, we'll make a decision if we want to continue with that or try something else. Once again, that doesn't get a lot of discussion here in the United States, although I think it was Minnesota kind of built something like that into its medical marijuana regime. But so if you're a risk-averse jurisdiction and you don't want to just immediately jump to the kind of the profit maximization model, you've got other choices out there. And I know we're here in California, we're here in LA, so I imagine a lot of you might be thinking, well, look, the legalization discussion is over here in California. But I'd hesitate, or I'd push you to kind of step back from that a little bit for a few different reasons. First of all, the state still hasn't released what its regulations are going to be. So I think as soon as and there are multiple agencies involved, so once that comes out of Sacramento, there's going to be a huge debate, throughout the state about whether or not those are the right regulations. Second thing to keep in mind is that, like I said, this is still all illegal under federal law. And once again, I would be skeptical of anyone who claims that they know what the federal government is going to do about marijuana at the state level. Nobody really knows yet. But the third thing, which I alluded to before, in California, is that Prop 64 gives the local jurisdictions a tremendous amount of discretion here. So I think you're going to see a lot of debates about, well, do we allow producers? Do we allow deliveries? Do we allow retail shops? And also the marijuana bars. That's going to be very different from Colorado and Washington in that local jurisdictions can make allowances for on-site consumption, So you can be walking down the street, you can go to this bar to get your gin and tonic or Cabernet. You can go, a couple stores down, and that's where you can hang out and consume edibles. And I'm not sure how it's going to work with indoor air laws. I mean, I think a lot's going to depend on the local jurisdictions there. But you're going to, even though Prop 64 passed, Prop M passed here in LA, I think you're still going to hear a lot about marijuana policy in Southern California. And I think the final thing I'd like to say is kind of as you're kind of participating or kind of listening to those discussions is to remember that reasonable people can disagree about what to do when it comes to marijuana policy. So much of this comes down to personal values and your preferences for risk. There are some people that they don't want the government telling them what to put in their bodies. They're going to vote one way. There's some people that are so fed up with drug prohibition, they're going to vote that way. There are other people that are opposed to intoxication. They're probably going to vote this way. For those that are unsure about this from a public health standpoint, it might depend on the details. And so an anecdote here. So when we were working on that first edition of the book, I was working on it with 3 other co-authors. So we worked together to kind of come up with those first 15 chapters with 140 questions. And we were all in agreement about kind of here's what the science says and here's what the science doesn't say. But then at the end we said, well, what if we added a chapter 16 where we each wrote a couple pages about our opinions about marijuana legalization, how we think things should play out given the evidence. We didn't plan it this way, but it turns out all 4 of us were all over the map. One was very pro-legalization, one was very anti-legalization. There were a couple of us that were in the middle, wanted reform, not necessarily a for-profit model. But here it was. I mean, we all agreed on what the science said. But still, our personal values and our preferences for risk really then ended up shaping kind of our policy prescriptions. So with that, I will close, and I look forward to kind of continuing this discussion.